Congressman Tom MacArthur, and I represent New Jersey's 3rd Congressional District, which is home to 65,000 veterans. Today's story is about one of those veterans, Ernest Kaufman. Many know Mr. Kaufman as a successful farmer who went on to be president of the Ocean County Farm Bureau, but his story goes back far before that. In 1938, he was living in Germany as a young man. On the night of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when thousands of synagogues were burned down, tens of thousands of German Jews were carted away to concentration camps. Ernest Kaufman was one of them. For 4 weeks, he witnessed man's brutality against other men. And due to his family's ceaseless efforts on his behalf, he was released and permitted to emigrate to the United States. He could have stopped there. But after Pearl Harbor, Ernest volunteered, joined the armed services, and went back to Europe to fight for our nation. He went back to Germany, where his capture would have resulted in certain death. And he went back as an intelligence officer. He served our nation, he earned a Bronze Star, and he deserves our gratitude. I hope his story today will inspire you to look at the men and women that serve our nation and to see all that they've done to restore freedom and preserve our way of life in this world. Thank you.
Today is February 8th, 2016, and we're interviewing Ernest Kaufman. Ernest is a veteran of the Second World War. And Ernest, can you tell us something about your early life? We know that you were raised in the North Rhine River region. Tell us about your early life and the history of your family.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Western Germany, not far from the border of Holland and Belgium. Until I was 10 years old, I went to the local elementary school in Drove, and then I went to the gymnasium, which is basically the equivalent of a private school here, hoping to someday become a veterinarian. And things were okay until 1933. I had friends everywhere. They stayed at my house, I stayed at their houses until Hitler came into power. Then all of a sudden things changed. And kids were told not to associate with Jewish students anymore, and eventually we became isolated. And then in 1935, the edict came, no Jews in schools of higher learning anymore. And I was told at the end of the school year, that's the end of your education and you're out. Then, of course, it became a question of, well, what do you do when you get out? In those days, edicts became worse and worse, and emigration became basically a topic around the dinner table. I went home, and I was lucky enough that my grandfather, who had been in business for quite a few years in a heating and plumbing business, he had a lot of friends in the neighborhood. He found a job for me with a Christian family, a man who had an automobile repair shop, and I worked there for quite a while until the morning of the 10th of November, 38. I get a frantic phone call from my sister, Ernest, go home immediately. All the synagogues are burning, and get home to the parents. I get on my bike about 15 miles away from home, past the burned out synagogue, past some Jewish home that had been vandalized, and come to my home. Luckily, it had not been damaged in any way. They'd simply passed us by. I'm not there for a half hour, and our local policeman shows up. We had a one-man police force in town. The town had a population of about 800. And the policeman says, look, I've got orders to arrest every Jewish male between the ages of 16 and 65, quote unquote, for their own protection from the enraged German populace. Reason being, a young Polish Jew had killed a German consular official in Paris when he asked about the whereabouts of his parents, who had been basically arrested by the Germans and taken to the Polish border and simply dumped across the border. Well, the kid obviously in the fight with the German consular must have had a gun or something like that and killed him. That was the reason that Goebbels, who was Germany's propaganda minister, used, of course, to incite the population. International Jewry is rising up against us, and we got to do something about it. The result was arresting probably 30 or 40,000 Jewish males between the ages of 16 and 65 and shipping them off to the various concentration camps. I mean, there was Dachau and there was Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. They were the three that they were sent to. And, well, the way I ended up there, the local policeman, a decent man, in fact, he was a neighbor of ours and a customer of ours. My father was a butcher. And we were, in fact, his oldest son and I used to ride together going to school, 6 miles each way by bike to Düren. And he said, look, Leo, my father's name was Leo, I'll disregard my orders. He knew my father wasn't 65 years old yet. But he said, but Ernest, you're going to have to go along. So I went along with him, and he put me into the local jail that happened to be a converted room in the local firehouse. Well, I spent about 2 nights there. In fact, the next morning, the first night, after the first night, the policeman came and saw to us and saw that everything was okay. And then he also sent another man home who wasn't 65 years old yet, but who had a family. So another young man and I were the only ones left in jail. Food was brought to us by our parents. Until the next morning, a car came and with an armed brown-shirt man riding shotgun. We were taken to Düren, the county seat, and there we were put on the bus with a number of other people from the county that also had been arrested. My brother-in-law was among them. And we were taken to Aachen, which is the district capital, and that was also Gestapo, secret police headquarters. There we had a roll call, and then we were marched off to the railroad station. There was a train that was waiting for us, basically, and it took off. We had no idea where we were headed. And on the way, the train stopped at a number of other stations, picking up more men. Eventually, I don't know after how many hours, we ended up at Weimar. And then, of course, we knew what was up. Weimar is right next to the Buchenwald concentration camp. We were chased off the train. A bus took us to the camp, and there we were lined up, roll call, and the heads were shaved, and then we were marched off to barracks that I'm sure a lot of people have seen what they look like in the various camps, open on one end, and basically inside was arranged like shelving, everything layers about 2 or 3 feet, 3 feet one above the other. And that was our home as long as we were going to be in camp. And basically, once in camp, we were kept separate from the regular camp customers that had been there for a long time. Those were the political prisoners that they'd had there for quite some time, communists, socialists, Catholic priests, homosexuals, gypsies, you name it, Jewish people, and also regular common criminals. And they all wore a striped prison garb. We were just herded into an area surrounded by a chain link fence and barbed wire around it. And we're not made to work, we're not doing anything, we were just there and milled around every day. There was a roll call every morning. We were fed once a day, and the way that worked is we're lined up in columns. The first group of people were given a mess kit or a bowl and a spoon, and prisoners from the other camp had come in with food, and each of us got a label full of what I used to call unidentifiable slop, and ate it, standing in line, and then handing the mess kits and the bowl and spoon unwashed to the next guy behind us, and that went on until the whole group was fed. That was pretty much the daily routine. Other than that, we just milled around in camp and watched and see what went on in the other side of camp. And every now and then someone was called for an interview, but basically nothing was going on. Conditions, of course, were horrible. This was the middle of November by then, and all we were wearing was the clothes that on our backs that we had come with, and we sort of hung close together to stay warm. But there were also a lot of people older than 65 that the Nazis had arrested in other parts of Germany, and some of these people simply couldn't stand the rigors of it, and a lot of them died. And we just had to stand there and watch them die. There's nothing we could do about it. On the other hand, we were lucky enough that we weren't on the other side of the fence, because there in the mornings we saw prisoners lined up for roll call and then marched off or driven off to work details. That was okay. In the evening, we saw them come back, and then they were lined up again for roll call again, and then they had to stand there and watch punishment being meted out. That is where the SS guys outdid themselves or each other with how much punishment they could basically inflict on people. We saw them flog people until they were unconscious, tie them to a pole and flog them. We saw them hang people. Well, we've seen people hang before. We saw them tie a man's hands behind his back, then hang him on what I thought was meat hooks, like meat hooks, on the wall until, of course, they fainted and fell, and then they cut them down. And if you think that was bad, the worst thing we saw was when they took a prisoner, stuck him into a barrel that was spiked with nails, and rolled him down the hill. And then, of course, bleeding as he was, let dogs finish him off. I mean, that's man's inhumanity in action. And the SS guards enjoyed doing what they were doing. Of course, by that time, people in Germany really didn't know what was going on in the camps, and whenever somebody was killed like this, the family always got what was supposed to be his ashes, and always with an explanation, well, he was shot while trying to escape. That was the explanation they got. Well, I was in camp for a little over 3 weeks, and we had absolutely no idea what was going on. My brother-in-law and I, we stuck together. The other man from all over that was with us, and I also met 2 cousins of mine from other parts of Germany. That basically we were all in the same boat, and we had absolutely no idea what was to happen to us. Our families at home had been told that anybody who could prove that he would leave Germany reasonably soon would have a place to go to. Could be released from concentration camp if they could prove that they would leave Germany before too long. Well, my parents had absolutely no idea what to do. After all, we grew up in Germany. We knew nothing but German, the German language. We had no relatives outside the country to speak of. And my parents contacted a friend of mine whom I had met in Essen when I was there as an apprentice. And they contacted him. He had gone to this country. He had an uncle. He would be here for years. And they knew his address, and they told him, look, Ernest is in concentration camp, and he needs somebody to sponsor to get out of concentration camp. Is there anything that you can do to get him out? Well, my friend John spoke to the people he was rooming with and told them, look, I've got a friend sitting in concentration camp. He needs a sponsor. He needs an affidavit of support. What can I do to help him? They told him, we'll do it. Not knowing me, they didn't know me from Adam, didn't know anything about me at all. They sent the necessary papers sponsoring me to the American consulate at Stuttgart, which is what it took. And with that information, which of course he passed on to my parents, my father went to the Gestapo and said, look here, this is what's going on. And they issued my release from concentration camp. This is how I got out after close to 4 weeks. Of course, the proviso was that I'd have to leave Germany in a reasonably short time. Now, this was December by then, and of course, the paper war usually takes a while. From the sponsors' papers went to the American consulate at Stuttgart. And fortunately, I forgot to mention this earlier, while I was in Essen at one point, I got my name, and my brother-in-law as well, on the waiting list of the German quota for immigration to the United States. Fortunately, at the time when I did this, I had no idea whether I was ever going to go there or whatnot. In those days, Palestine was still something that we hoped for because there were still some people going to Palestine. But just on a whim, I guess, we got our names on the list, and we were lucky. Well, I got called to the American consulate in April, so that was 3 months later, almost 4 months later. And after a thorough physical and mental exam, I got my visa with the proviso, you leave Germany within a very short time. I go home, go to the local mayor's office, mayor's office, and get my passport. Something new in the passport. Before, passports used to be typical German passports. Now there was a big J in the front, on the front cover of the passport. And there was another thing. All of a sudden, my name, instead of Ernst Kaufman, became Ernst Israel Kaufman. In other words, every Jewish male from that time on had to sign their names with the middle initial of Israel. The women's middle name became Sarah. So any document, any paper you signed had to be with this. That was my passport. Well, with the passport, and of course I don't have to tell about the anguish our families went through. My sister had left a couple of weeks before I did, luckily with my brother-in-law, who also managed to get an affidavit from some distant relatives of his he had in this country. And I left, and basically when I left at the railroad station in Cologne, my mother was too distraught to go to the station with us. And a cousin of mine came with my father to see me off at the railroad station. And I'll never forget, my father's last words to me were, "Don't do anything I'd have to be ashamed of." Now here I was an 18-year-old kid, and this is tears in his eyes. Those were the last words, and of course, there was always the hope that somehow, sometime we would see each other again, but of course, times proved differently. And at the pier in New York, I was received by John, my friend, and Ann and Joe, who were my sponsors. Well, they themselves had no place for me. They had no place and no real plans for me at that particular point, not knowing what to expect. And they found a home for me for the summer, at least this was May, at least until schools let out. They had me stay as basically a babysitter for 2 young boys. But those were my first 6 weeks in this country. When schools let out and the parents were able to come back, then they found a place for me with a friend of theirs, the Lehman House friend, Dr. Esselstein, who had a practice, I think, in Brooklyn or wherever, but who also owned a gentleman farm in Claverack near Hudson-on-Hudson. So I went up there for the summer, and that's basically where I learned to speak English, because nobody spoke a word of German, and I had to do what every immigrant does. And basically what I did is memorize 25 words every night with the dictionary and try to keep it. And from there I went to Philadelphia, where my sister had finally settled, and my brother-in-law. I joined a German Jewish club which had come in existence that also had a soccer team. And it so happened that I didn't only play soccer, but I also met the manager's youngest sister, who eventually became my wife. So a lot of things happened. But anyhow, this was in 1939, and between 1939 and 1940, I went from one job to the other. Never did for less money, but not always for the better. At once I saw the dirty rags that it was so bad they had me basically vomit, and I had to quit the job and whatnot. Until I finally found a job doing mechanical work. Kensington Wagon Works was doing defense contractual work. They were building truck bodies for Bendix Aviation, which in those days was a big defense contractor. And Mr. Durst, the owner, said, "Look, Ernest," after he'd seen what I could do, "why don't you go for an occupational deferment from the draft?" At that time, I had, like everybody else, since I had gotten my green card right after I arrived in this country, I was registered for the draft. And he said, "Why don't you try to get the deferment from the draft?" I hoped, of course, to get one because, again, I was trying to save as much money as I could to get my parents out, who by that time couldn't pay for passage to this country anymore had they been able to come. Would have to be paid for with foreign currency. So I went to the draft board, got an occupational deferment. Well, I guess it must have been, I don't know how much later, Pearl Harbor came. December 7th, 41. And in fact, the night of December 6th to 7th, I was sitting in my then girlfriend's kitchen with her talking about planning a future. And we decided, well, you know, things are tough. I was trying to get my parents out. She had a brother who was about to get into the service and whatnot. We weren't getting anywhere. We decided not to see each other for a while. And I went home. I got home about 4 o'clock in the morning, heard the news of Pearl Harbor, get on the phone to my girlfriend and say, "Look, I'm coming right over." She says, "What are you coming over for?" So I told her about Pearl Harbor, and I said, "Look, things have changed. I'm going to enlist because I've got a reason to go and fight." Day after Pearl Harbor, I go and try to enlist. Go to City Hall, a day or two after, I forgot exactly when. Go to City Hall in Philadelphia, have a physical exam, and then there's a bunch of papers to fill out. One of them, one of the questions on one of the papers was citizenship status. I wrote in there, applied for. Somebody looked at it. "Buddy, you can't enlist. You're not a citizen." So I said, "Look, I want in. How can I get into the service?" Well, they said, "You can always go to your draft board and tell them to call you." Well, that's exactly what I did. I went to my draft board, told them to cancel my occupational deferment, and I was ready to go. Now, this was a couple of days after December 7th. On February 8th, I think it was, I was at Camp Meade in Maryland, taking off my civvies and putting on a military uniform. I ended up on a train that headed for Macon in Georgia, Camp Wheeler, infantry basic training. Well, the usual 90 days of basic training, and after 90 days, there were a bunch of IQ tests and whatnot. Well, I'd taken some of the tests, and I was asked to go to post headquarters. "We want you to volunteer for officer training school." Well, I go to post headquarters, somebody opens my folder. "Oh, you're not a citizen. You're not eligible." Same thing as with volunteering for the service. I ended up as a replacement going to the Yankee Division, the 24th Infantry Division, the National Guard outfit in Massachusetts. In the middle of 42, Congress passed a law that anyone who had served honorably in the military for at least 6 months would not have to wait the customary 5 years that it takes for a legal immigrant to become naturalized and to become a citizen. Well, the minute my 6 months were up, I figured, why not? I applied to go to OCS. Well, it went to division headquarters. They approved it, sent the request on to Fort Benning, And the first week in January, I was on my way to Fort Benning to infantry officer training. Well, once we graduated, we all went in all kinds of different directions. I was shipped off to Fort McClellan in Alabama for infantry training there. And I was drilling recruits, teaching them the same stuff that I'd just learned the year before. I got orders to go to the Pacific, and I went to headquarters and talked to the personnel officer and said, look, I speak German, I have a working knowledge of French. What can I do in the Pacific? In Europe, I can be of use, because I didn't have to tell them I hated the Germans. And he listened, and he changed my orders, and I went to Camp Ritchie in Maryland, which was an intelligence training center, where people were trained in psychological warfare, order of battle, and weapons training, and interrogation, photo interpretation, all the things that basically fall into the intelligence sector of work. It's a rush course where some people came right from basic training, or got their basic training, and then into combat training. And well, I had that already, so basically I got the course, and right after the course was over, I was shipped over to England and became a member, in fact second in command of a prisoner interrogation team.
How'd you get to England?
We went to England on the Queen Elizabeth, which at that time, I think in '38, was commissioned, was supposed to be an ocean liner, and it had been taken over by the military. It was painted gray and whatnot, and anti-aircraft guns on top. And instead of 2,000 passengers, which was the ship's capacity, and 1,000 in crew, there were 12,000 of us who went over in one clip, sleeping on hammocks in the cabins in 8-hour shifts, and we made the trip in quick time, unescorted by any other ships, because the ship was fast enough to outrun U-boats. And an uneventful ride, except, like I say, we were kind of squeezed, and we were lucky to get on deck. And we landed in Scotland, and from there we went to the Salisbury Plains in England, near Swindon. There was Evesham, and Warminster was a staging area for a lot of American troops. And there we were assigned to, the Military Intelligence Service assigned us to the 19th Corps, which was headquartered in Warminster. And while there, of course, we sort of honed our skills a little bit. We did practice training on German prisoners that had been captured in Africa and were in a stockade nearby. The unit commander was there, and he watched it, and he said, look, I want you, when we land in Normandy, I want you to be assigned to my unit. Eventually it came to pass. We landed on D+5, and shortly thereafter I was with the 113th Cavalry and interrogating prisoners that we captured. I was with the front units all along, and at one point we were near the vicinity of a big wooded area in France. I don't know exactly anymore where it was, but it was about the middle of July or so. In Forêt de Breteuil, it was called. And the word was the woods are heavily defended by the Germans. They got a lot of traps in there and whatnot. We got to be careful. So I suggested to Colonel Biddle, who was the cavalry commander, why don't we try a hawk calling deal? Well, he agreed, and I went with my jeep, sandwiched between two light tanks, moving slowly towards the woods. And there I just, with an improvised loudspeaker, foghorn or whatever it was, I hollered into the woods that, look, why are you Germans still fighting the war? You know you've lost the war anyhow, and we're making steady progress. You're better off being American prisoners. Not only that, we treat you well. You even get American cigarettes and whatnot. And why don't you just give up? Because why fight for a losing cause? I mean, words to that effect, not exactly the same thing. And not a shot was fired at us, and we pulled back, and the next morning we went through the woods, collected about 100 prisoners without firing a shot, and we moved on. So that was one of my psychological warfare deals that I did during the war. Well, I went back to Corps headquarters, to Cavalry headquarters, who at the time was staying put in Maastricht, which is not far from Aachen. Aachen is the first German city that the 1st Division captured. And that was the first basically major city we got across the Siegfried Line. It was a big achievement, but then of course from there the next objective was the Rhine River. And while we were there in Maastricht, and I figured years ago when I was growing up in Germany yet, in 1930s, I had watched the Germans build a dam on a river called Ruhr. Now, I had no idea what they were building it for in such haste. And I figured, well, while we're there, Aachen was in our hands. Why not go and investigate? Well, with my men, I go to Aachen. We went, found the Water District Administration office, and found a safe that we blew open. You know, hand grenades do a pretty good job sometimes. I find in there a treasure trove of German military documents, which describe, first of all, how both dams, the old existing one and the new one, were built, what their capacity was, and above all, what would happen if the dams were blown. How many billions of water would cascade downriver, how long an area would be inundated, how large an area would be impassable, and all this stuff that proved to be so important that when I came back to the G2 with it, because at that time, as I said, we were at more or less at Corps headquarters, Colonel Platt sent me immediately to the Army engineer and said, tell him what you found. And I get to the Army engineer, tell him what I found and whatnot, and he, of course, I said I'll translate it as quickly as I can. It caused attack orders to 12th Army Group, which in my opinion was probably 250,000 men, if not more, was halted immediately because they were supposed to go early in November to attack across the Rhine, was halted immediately, and basically shortly after that came, of course, the Battle of the Bulge and whatnot, and eventually the Germans blew those dams to cover their own retreat rather than to keep us from advancing. And once the flooding had subsided, of course, we were able to get across the Ruhr River. So it may have saved a catastrophe. The 1st Division had taken Aachen, and then the 126th Infantry Division, a regiment, was heading towards Dover, my hometown. I figured, okay, I'll see what I can do, if I can maybe get attached to them and see what happened to my folks. Well, of course, I had no trouble getting myself attached to the 1st Division regiment. We get into my hometown, which was completely evacuated because of the heavy fighting that had been taking care in the area. There wasn't a soul I could see. I got into my parental home. Didn't look any more the way I remembered it. And the funny thing is I come up to the attic and there is about 6 or 7 cubicles made with raw wooden boards. I had no idea what they were, had no idea why they were there and whatnot. And I didn't find out until after the war what had happened. In May of 1941, the Germans had moved all the Jews of my hometown, 26 people, evicted them out of their homes, from their homes, moved them into my parental home, and kept them there until they were deported in March of 1942, and that was almost 9 months. They kept 26 people, some of them kids under 10 years of age, many people over than 80 years old. One house, one toilet. You can just imagine the misery these people live with. And the funny thing is this, what kept these people going more than anything else, other than the meager rations that the Nazis allowed them, was that Christian neighbors at night went and smuggled food to them to give them some more than they had. And I heard it said after the war that the reasons the Germans claimed they moved these people together was so that when they were ready to deport them, they didn't have to go and hunt them up. So I can just imagine how these people lived. And this is funny, this was in May of 41, they were together. Now, we had correspondence from my parents until, close to Pearl Harbor, close to December. Immigration had stopped, but mail still went. Never once was there a mention of the hardships that my parents and all the other people went through in the mail, because they didn't dare it would be picked up by the censors. The letters always began with, "We and our relatives are all doing well." And then, of course, they talked about generalities, but not much questions about what we were doing and how we were doing. Nothing else. We never heard about it. We never found out about it. But I still have nightmares thinking about how these people had to exist there. And then an even worse fate hit them afterwards, because in March of 42, they were all shipped off to a camp called Belzec in eastern Poland near the Ukrainian border, where within a span of 9 months the Germans killed 500,000 people, men, women and children. That was a death camp. You know, there is a distinction between death camp and concentration camp. The concentration camps are the places where the Germans basically worked people to death. They didn't kill them outright. That's the places where they give people tattoo numbers on their arms and whatnot to identify them. And they were all inside of Germany. There was not a single quote-unquote death camp in Germany. I mean, the Germans weren't stupid. All the death camps, Auschwitz and Majdanek and Belzec and Treblinka, and you name them, they were all in Poland. And that's where they took them off the trains and moved them into the gas chambers. I rejoined my unit, and around the 7th or 8th of April, a couple of civilians came across our lines and they said, we come from a town of Einbeck that normally has a population of about 12,000, and that population has swelled up to about 32,000 with refugees from the east, and we got a military hospital here, and we also got a military headquarters here. We got a general who wants to put up a fight in the worst way. Is there anything the Americans can do to help us? Well, like a stupid idiot, and I always say on stupid impulse, I kept the guys there until nighttime. Next morning, I go into town with my driver who volunteered to go with me, a white rag on my Jeep. In the middle of town, we get stopped. And I said, look, I got orders to see the commanding general. Well, the guy said, stop me, get into the back of the Jeep, and directed me to go to headquarters. And once we come close to headquarters, those two get out and start marching me towards the building. I turned to my driver and said, get the hell back there, see if you can make it, and tell him what I'm up to. Because nobody else back there knew what I was doing. Well, I get taken into a conference room or whatever it was. There sit about 5 or 6 staff officers, and needless to say, the questions began. Where you're from, what you do, and whatnot. And let's face it, having been trained just in that, I had the right answers for them, and what I guess what scared me the most is when they asked me, well, where did you learn to speak German so well? Well, my answer was, well, I took German in college, and languages were my major, and I loved languages, and I practiced a lot of it. Well, fortunately, the questioning didn't last much longer. Once that question came up, I was called to the general's office. Stand in front of the general there. I tell him my name is so-and-so, and I'm from the American commanding officer opposing you. I have orders to tell you, or to ask for the immediate surrender of the town of Einbeck, and that we're prepared to attack, and I'm supposed to wait for an answer. And you'll be held responsible for any loss of life and property in the town if you decide to defend the city. The general tells me to wait outside. I'm being taken back to the same conference room I was in before. It was empty now. I was scared to say, oh, let's face it. And was there for about 15 minutes. Well, within that 15 minutes, all of a sudden, I hear the general holler across the hallway or whatever. Who the hell let this driver get away from here? In other words, obviously, my driver had made it out of town, and I was lucky enough that he had made it. Now, 15 minutes later, the general calls me into his office. Well, I've decided to accompany you to your commanding officer and to surrender the city. The next thing that happens is, here I sit next to the driver in the Mercedes staff car, shaking like a leaf, scared to death, with two generals in the back seat, and the Mercedes staff car moving at walking speed, so to speak, towards our lines, followed by more than 35 officers and over 300 men. Some other records said over 600 men. I don't know which was true. Anyhow, towards our line, we get into our lines, and the officers and the men are basically received and processed by an MP unit that was attached to the 113th at that time. We captured a lot of prisoners in those days. And I took the two generals to the cavalry's command post to Colonel Biddle. I made a formal introduction and all that, and then I asked the generals to please surrender their weapons to Colonel Biddle. They were outraged at having to surrender at somebody of lesser rank. But of course, being the interpreter, well, gentlemen, Colonel Biddle is the commanding officer in this area, and therefore it's his responsibility, and he expects you to turn your weapons over to him. Of course, what could they do? They turned their weapons over to him, and after that, of course, they were escorted out and taken back to the rear, where they probably were processed further. Well, I go back into Einbeck the next morning, when with the cavalry units. Needlessly, no fighting. A lot of white rags hanging out of the windows in the population, and make a fellow by the name of Keim, one of the men who had come to ask for help, the acting mayor of the town. The interesting thing is, 20 years later, I get a telegram from the town of Einbeck, this man still being the mayor of the town, thanking me once more for having saved the city and its population from disaster. So that was the story of the city of Einbeck. Well, of course, the cavalry moved on. We come into a place called Wernigerode. That was by then the 11th of April. And this was the 8th of April was Einbeck. The 11th of April, we take the town of Wernigerode in Thuringia. We took it the night before. We were bivouacked there. And the next morning, I'm on my way to City Hall to talk to the mayor about to give the mayor instructions about where civilians were to turn in their firearms and give them some instructions of what we expected the population to do. And on the way there, right in the middle of the walked towards the city hall. We were ambushed by two SS men who obviously had either hidden in town the night before, during the night, or sneaked back in the morning. We were taken in crossfire, and the intelligence officer of the 113th, who was with me, and two MPs, returned fire. I returned fire too. I thought I did. I thought I hit one of the guys. But the MPs didn't get hurt, but Captain Hutton, the intelligence officer of the cavalry, and I were both wounded. And I only remember being dragged into a doorway someplace near there, and I heard a woman say, "Oh, that is terrible." That I still remember in German. I was out. That was it. That was the end of the war for me. I was shot in my back. I had a collapsed lung and some shattered ribs and a completely shattered left arm. And I woke up a week later in Nevak Hospital and with a Purple Heart pinned to my bed sheet. And from there I was shipped to England and was in a military hospital near Exeter in England for almost 3 months. I had my left arm in traction, and my chest wounds took about close to 2 months to heal and close up. Well, the war was over in the 8th of May, but I didn't get home stateside until the 23rd of July. And I came home on the hospital ship and ended up at Atlantic City at Thomas England General Hospital, which at the time was considered to be an orthopedic hospital. A joyous reunion with my sister and my girlfriend. And of course, at the time, my girlfriend and I thought, why wait? We did get married the 29th of July. In other words, a week after I came home from overseas after 2 years. Then came convalescence. Well, anyhow, I went to Rutgers, put 2 6-week convalescent leaves together, and took a course in poultry husbandry. Poultry farms in those days were pretty plentiful in New Jersey. Why not a poultry farm? 2 reasons. One, I'd get to work with animals, and another one was, at the time, I didn't know what my parents' fate was. I ended up in Valley Forge in the convalescent center. During that time, Congress passed a law that anyone who had served 18 months or longer and was injured in combat could get promoted. Well, I was captain then, and on the basis of that congressional law, I was promoted to major. Well, I still wasn't well. Basically, when I was operated on, the doctors told me, look, it's going to take at least 5 years before you can expect to be as well as you can ever hope to be. And there's not much you can do about it except wait it out. Well, here I was. I couldn't go back to mechanical work because of my damaged left arm and whatnot. I had no professional training other than the mechanical work I had done. What can I do? I contacted the commanding officer of the European Command Intelligence Center, ECIC, which was headquartered in Oberursel, just outside of Frankfurt. 2 months later, I was on my way back to Germany in November '46. I was put in charge of a document center. At the document center, our function was primarily to get documents on the Russians, friendship with whom had sort of slowly disintegrated, let me put it this way. And of course, the other thing is this: even though the bigwigs at the Nuremberg trials had been disposed of already, there were still lesser criminals, and we still found a bunch of documents that basically would help us convict them. So that went on for almost 2 years. One interesting thing that I might mention here is, I mean, the way things were at ECIC or Camp King, we had a lot of the scientists that ended up in this country. We also had a lot of German military personnel there some of them that were willing to cooperate with us, and of course some of them also were the old Nazis who wouldn't. Well, there was one military officer there who happened to be from Würzburg, which was my wife's hometown. I knew it. I knew he was strictly an old Wehrmacht or an old army man, not at all a Nazi sympathizer, although he'd fought, of course. I called my wife and tell her I got a dinner guest tonight, and maybe you'll enjoy talking to him. Well, she didn't know who it was or what it was. I didn't mention it. I checked out a German military officer, take him home. He and my wife find out that they have a lot of common acquaintances and common things that they can talk about. We had dinner together. It was a real nice conversation. Well, to make a long story short, the man I had taken home was Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, who was Rommel's chief of staff in Africa. And here, he was basically helping us, giving us information on the Russians. But here, I check him out, take him home to dinner, take him back to camp the same evening, and a good time was had by all. Anyhow, I get picked up on the reduction in force. I guess that's what it is. And then, of course, the first people they let go, tried to get rid of people who are not 100%, and I wasn't. I ended up being boarded at Walter Reed Hospital. And I was there from December until April. I went through physical therapy, occupational therapy, you name it. And finally, in early April, I go before a board and I'm being found fit for general duty. Well, to make a long story short, I got orders to go to Fort Dix, the 9th Infantry Training Division, which it was then. And there I became executive officer of a battalion in the 60th Infantry. I went out on a night maneuver on bivouac with units. It was a cold night. It was November, or was December even, of 1950. And my left arm freezes up. I can't even pull my pistol. They declared me unfit for military duty and they recommended retirement. And I was retired for physical disability with 40% disability, which I'm carrying with me. That was the end of my military career. Now the next thing is, what do you do? I had taken the poultry courses at Rutgers, and I figured at one time or another I wasn't going to make the military my career. I was lucky in one respect. There was a Lieutenant Jack Arthur at Fort Dix who had served with me at Camp King, in other words, ECIC in Oberursel. And I had told him, look, I'm getting out of the service, I'm looking for a farm, and I don't know yet what we're going to do for a living when I get out of the service, and that's happening within a few weeks. Jack invited me to dinner in Toms River, where he lived. And while we were there for dinner, he had another couple there, and it happened to be the Ocean County agricultural agent, who is basically on the staff of Rutgers University. Well, there is a farm in New Egypt, and I can put you in touch with a feed salesman who knows about that farm. We owned the farm for almost 35 years, and starting from scratch with no chickens and room for 2,000, we ended up in the end with 45,000, capacity for 45,000 chickens. We had our own feed mill, we made our own feed. By the way, 6 tons of feed a day is what we used. And we had our own processing plant, we wholesaled all our eggs, and we did this successfully. And in fact, for a lot of years, we were the major supplier at the Fort Dix Commissary, who used an awful lot of our so-called farm fresh nearby eggs, which was a good selling point for us, and kept us there without ever, in all those years, having had a single complaint. Well, my wife was still busy with Hadassah, the charitable group, and I started basically being active at the Jewish Community Center in Cherry Hill at the Holocaust Memorial Center there, and became a member of the speaker roster there. And I've been going around, I've been speaking at schools and to schools and civic organizations, military organizations, and whatnot, to anybody who wants to listen to my story. And that's been keeping me busy, and still is. I'm still doing this. And it so happens right now I just finished my memoir, and I'm lucky enough that's been published.
And I just want to say, Ernest, you are the epitome of what has made our nation great. You came to this country as an immigrant. You've escaped from an evil dictator. You served in the military to protect your new country. A warrior, you excelled in a very difficult job. A dedicated combat soldier, you were able to save both American and German lives as the war raced to a conclusion. Wounded in battle, you were recognized for your bravery by earning the Bronze Star. And in the minds of some of your fellow fighters, that award should have been the Silver Star. In civilian life, you fulfilled the American dream when you took over a failing business, and through hard work and innovation, you and your wife converted it into a prosperous enterprise. Ernest, you're 5'3", but you're a giant of a man.
Well,
Yep, the Armed Forces Heritage Museum salutes you.